Welcome to Building the Future, hosted by Kevin Horick. With millions of listeners a month, Building the Future has quickly become one of the fastest rising programs, with a focus on interviewing startups, entrepreneurs, investors, CEOs, and more. The radio and TV show airs in 15 markets across the globe, including Silicon Valley. For full showtimes, past episodes, or to sponsor the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com.
Welcome back to the show. Today we have Chet Kapoor. He's the chairman and CEO at DataStax. Chet, welcome to the show.
Hello, Kevin. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, me as well. I'm actually selfishly super excited to learn more about what you guys are doing because I'm in tech and I actually think what you guys are doing is very much needed for a lot of companies. But before we get into all that, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Absolutely. Born and brought up in Calcutta, India.
Okay, very cool.
It's on the eastern part of India, and the journey has been. I'm humbled every day of the journey that I've had a chance to take. It actually started. I was an avid reader. It started at the British Council Library in Calcutta, and I read a little book called The Little Kingdom. It was by a person by the name of Mike Moritz. Mike was a Times reporter then, and then went on to run Sequoia, the venture fund. And so The Little Kingdom was about two Steves that created this company called Apple. And I was fascinated, and Mike's just a awesome storyteller, was fascinated. This is 1983. And I was fascinated by it. And I was like, yeah, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to go and work for Steve Jobs. And so started plotting a course, took a whole bunch of computer classes and things like that, came to the US, did my CS and EE degree from Arizona State. And while I was at ASU, I had the chance to actually start working for Next. It was my first job out of college. So it has been a spectacular ride from Calcutta all the way to the Bay Area, working for one of the biggest industry icons the world will ever have, right?
Totally. Interesting. So what got you passionate about computers and technology at an early age? Was it that book or was it other stuff as well?
It was actually and I would love to say it was, I was building computers when I was 6 years old. That was not what happened, right? It was actually the book. And once I read the book and I got into computers, and you've got to realize in those days, right? It's not like computers were floating around all over India, right? I mean, and so it was something you had to go to, and you would have to book time. And this is during the mini computer stuff, PCs had not shown up in a big way. And so, but that's where it started. But once I got into it, here's what intrigued me. It was not just the science part. It was the art part that actually got me. The whole convergence of, but this is going to change the way we live. This is going to change the way we work. That is what got me really excited. Yeah, I'm fairly technical. I can go fairly deep. But what really got me going was this convergence of how it changes people's lives and the companies they work for, and the technology itself. That continues, by the way, as you may hear, what excites me even today. It's the same feeling I had right when I was 16 years old, reading The Little Kingdom.
Interesting. That's actually quite fascinating. So walk us through your career at Next, and you've run and worked at and been acquired by some of the biggest companies on the planet. Walk us through your incredible career, maybe some highlights along the way, and then let's get into what you're doing today.
It all started at Next, right? And so it was my first job out of college. I really do believe that as I mentor folks now, I tell them that, be very careful on the people you go to work with in your first job because it will define you. And Next was an awesome experience because the single biggest thing beyond being 20 yards away from Steve and, making coffee, bringing coffee for the person that made coffee, right? The big thing from Next was it's all about people. And you have to absolutely, have to focus on hanging out with great people that are mission oriented and are really smart and really want to change the world. So it started there, and I got that very early. And then after Next, it was I ran a services company, and then worked for a company called Active Software. We created an industry called EAI in the integration space, and that was spectacular to see that that a company, along with a group of other companies, can come together and actually create an industry that didn't exist, right? And that was very fascinating. Went to BEA, ran the integration business there, and then went to this small open source company, and that's where in 2004, open source was something I got very intrigued with, and ran a company called Blue Code, and IBM acquired it.
Why did you get intrigued by open source? Sorry to cut you off.
There's no. It's by the way, it is awesome to see people from geographically very diverse locations, from very different companies that they work for, coming together all in a distributed way to create this great technology that people end up using to run their businesses, right? And that process of invention and creation was unknown to me. So the best way to put it in a phrase is software used to be built in a cathedral. And what open source did, it brought it to the bazaar. You didn't have to come to Silicon Valley. You could be sitting in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and still be one of the best contributors, right? So open source, and a lot of people think they understand open source, but you actually have to be in it to actually understand it and see how the commit process works, and how do people contribute code, and how do you have to do things by influence. And so that was something that I really wanted to understand. So I went off and did this, and then worked for IBM, which was great, and then embarked on this journey called Apogee.
Okay.
Which was great. We didn't have a product, we didn't have revenue, and it became a really good success. We took it public, and then Google acquired us a year after that. Spent 3 years at Google, grew the business, my last stop at Google was running education for Google, and then decided to branch back into doing something with a set of people that I worked with over the last 20 years, because we still have, we think data is taking off in a big way, and we wanted to do it in a very specific way. And so DataStax was where we landed, and we've been growing the company since.
Very cool. So how did you come up with the idea for DataStax, and what exactly is it?
So DataStax was founded in 2010, and Jonathan Ellis, who is one of our co-founders, is still with the company. But cool. It was founded with the concept that SQL databases are well structured, and the world was going to an unstructured world, not just transactional, but an unstructured world.
Totally.
And there was no database around that would scale massively.
Right.
Even in the SQL world, scaling massively is hard, right? And so Cassandra was born as a scale-out NoSQL database. And over the last 11 years, it has proved itself again and again and again. Kevin, think about any massive app or any website, and Cassandra is behind it, right? Cassandra was it actually came out of a lot of stuff that Facebook did. Right. And so it is, it's no question, it is the scale out database of choice. It is the standard for NoSQL databases. And so that's what was DataStax's business. But we have now expanded it, and we talk about the company is focused on the open data stack, right? So database is just one part of it, but you need other things, right? You have a database is basically data at rest. You need data in motion. You need APIs. You need to be cloud native with Kubernetes. And so we're bringing all of that together in what we call the open data stack. And developers and enterprises are absolutely loving it.
Sure, because you're saving them a huge amount of time, development, and technical knowledge, right? Like it's hard to find people that truly understand that whole part of an application. Is that fair to say?
It is very fair. So our and if you look at the two axes that we actually optimize every day.
Okay.
One of them is developer productivity.
Sure.
We want developers to be 5x more productive than they already are. They should not worry about things like scaling and Kubernetes operators and things like that. We do that for them. And the second thing is 5x cheaper, because data is exploding and so are the costs.
Totally.
Right. So it's all about, the developer productivity to get outside of the innovation stalemate, and then the TCO focus so you get out of the TCO debt spiral.
Interesting. So walk us through, how does a developer or a company actually use DataStax, and what's the learning curve to actually start using the product?
The learning curve is we think somebody who understands JavaScript and wants to build an app. We've really simplified this. Yeah, so somebody who understands JavaScript and want to build an app. We think that you should have not the part of the app that you're building in JavaScript, but from a database point of view, we think setting up a database that scales in the cloud should take you less than an hour.
Oh, wow.
And so we would, and then after that, you need to, when you have multi developer usage and you talk about going multi-region, it gets a little bit hairier, but your 0 to 60, as we call it, to much more than Hello World should be way south of an hour. We try to even target Hello World to be, less than 10 minutes.
Wow. Okay. So people can try you very quickly. Very
quickly. And Astra is our cloud product. Cassandra is a great scale-out database that has not been known to be easy to develop or operate.
Okay.
And so offering it as a cloud service and saying, hey, it's no ops, right? You don't have to worry about operating it. We do it as a service, and making it really easy with GraphQL, JSON, and REST and gRPC, making it really easy to consume for developers is the magic sauce that makes our business grow very fast.
Interesting. So can you maybe give us some examples of, you don't have to give company names, but how companies have been leveraging your technology, just so people can understand how they could potentially, like, oh, I'm in that space, or we could leverage that. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah. So let's talk about Home Depot. And it's very relevant to the pandemic, right? Home Depot has been using Cassandra for many years. And I think it's well documented that they've been using Cassandra with 100% uptime for over 5 years.
Wow. That's right? Like unheard of, right?
Yeah. So it's so it's awesome, right? I mean, it's been working really well, right? And if you talk to some of our other customers, they will tell you the same thing. Once they build it, then it just works and it scales really well and things like that. But when the pandemic hit, Home Depot went through something interesting. Their store traffic dropped significantly.
Sure.
But the demand increased.
Right.
Right? Because everybody was at home. They would want to do home projects and things like that. So a really big part of fulfillment of that demand had to come up with curbside, curbside pickup.
Right.
So they literally rolled out in less than 30 days. They built the functionality for curbside pickup in less than 30 days and rolled it out all across North America.
Wow.
And they
That's
did
quick.
it all. That is very, and by the way, and we're not talking about a toy app, right, Kevin? We're talking about something that millions of people use, right?
Sure.
And so, and it works really well. And all of that was done based on Cassandra, Kubernetes, DataStax, and other technologies, right? But the basis was what they do with us. So it's super interesting.
Okay. Do you maybe want to give us a couple other examples?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Macquarie Bank, financial services company based in Australia.
Okay.
They wanted to go off and actually have a 360-degree view of their customers.
Okay.
And why, right? The reason is because they wanted to start providing personalized products for each of their customers. They have over 1 million customers, by the way.
Wow.
Right? I mean, so and they're millions, right? So what they did was they created this 360 app that's all based on DataStax. And now, based on the information available, they have literally millions of SKUs where they can actually have personalized products for each of their customers, right? And they did this all in a 6-month period.
Wow,
right?
That's also very quick.
And so, yeah, so this is, and the reason the theme here is because they're focused on the business value, and we take them away from worrying about the utilities and the scaling and things like that. We make it easy to develop, easy to manage, and it just goes from there. So that would be a second example. The third one, again, going back to one that your listeners are very familiar with, FedEx.
Sure.
Right. FedEx, Federal Express's shipping application runs on DataStax. So every time you track your package tracking or anything like that, whether it's through a website or through a mobile app, you're actually using DataStax. And Federal Express has been using it for years, and it scales beautifully. I mean, think about it, right? Federal Express as a company is in 98% of the countries in the world.
Wow. I didn't realize
because they have to deliver packages.
That's awesome.
No, 98%.
Wow.
So it's massive.
Very cool. So how do you, or what are your thoughts and advice around companies struggling with this data problem? Because I know, well, you know that every company has good data, bad data, no data, some data. How do you work with companies at different stages or good, bad data to actually get it into the cloud, scaling, and start using DataStax?
So we start by having the conversation.
Okay.
That data is exploding, and the value of data is increasing exponentially. Right?
Okay.
It's just increasing, and so that is happening. So how do you get more and more value from your data? So one way to do that is to take all of it and put it into a warehouse, right? Use something like Snowflake or whatever else you want, and then run some, ML or algorithms on top, and you can get some insights. That's very good for what we call the deep lane.
Okay.
There's something parallel to that, which is where we live. It's called the fast lane, right? How do you take data from all these different databases you have and have a standardized way to access it and store it?
Sure.
Right? How do you make sure you do that? Because the value of data is not just an app. The value of data is to be used by other data, as well as by machine learning, as well as by data scientists, as well as by business analysts, right? And so how do you, so Kevin, and you will succinctly understand this, we've all built architectural pictures with the app on top and databases on the bottom.
Totally, yeah.
I think we're at a point where we have to flip it.
Oh, interesting.
The app is just one user of data. Sure. And I'm specifically not saying databases because databases are about database at rest.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more to data because you have to also talk about data in motion, right? Okay. And so you do that combination. But when you do that, you have to flip, whether it's a 3-tier, 2-tier, whatever app that you're building, you actually have to flip it around, and it's not databases on the bottom or data on the bottom. It's actually data on top. And that's how our enterprises think of it. So we have this kind of conversation with them, and they all get it, right? Everybody talks about it slightly differently, but they understand it to their very core. And our value proposition, back to what I said earlier, is very, very simple. We build products that developers love.
Sure.
That change the trajectory of the enterprises they work for.
Interesting.
So we are always talking to the CIO or to the VP of infrastructure, app development, data, and there are different titles in different places, CTOs, about an enterprise-wide view, and then making sure that developers love the products we build. Because at the end of the day, they are the users of the product.
Sure. Yeah, that's actually really interesting because you're right. Data has become so important. And like, to use an example, like you use some obviously huge clients that people have heard of, and all those clients of yours obviously have their own customers. And so in your Home Depot example, like the CEO and everybody in the C-suite and upper management and middle management, some of the junior people, obviously like Home Depot customers, like everybody's potentially pulling the same data at the same time for a different use case, for a different device, whether it's on a phone, at like a terminal in a store, or curbside, or, you know, wherever, right? And your data that has to be always kind of moving and adapting and updating and being live is so important these days that I think people don't realize how complicated it really is to do it yourself. And you need tools like you guys are offering to just handle it so you can keep up, so you can scale. And the reliability that you guys can offer is just like unheard of, right?
Absolutely. So Kevin, this is in your world, right? You're a designer. But if you don't have the right tools, you're going to spend more time on the technology and the tooling than actually designing.
100%.
Right? And that's exactly what we're doing for enterprises and for developers. But you have to do it for both, right?
Totally.
You build a product they love, and then you have to do it at an enterprise-wide level.
Well, and then you also have to design the interface around the data that's available today and that you could get tomorrow, right? Which I think a lot of companies don't think about. It's like, how does the interface scale and update and evolve as we get more data, new data, better data? Like, fair to say?
No, you nailed it. And what is interesting is it is not the interface, just for your listeners, is not just a UX manifestation. It can be a programmatic manifestation. So it is a combination of UX as well as APIs. Like I said earlier, not all data is going to be used by a UX part, right? There's got to be other applications that call it as well. So you have to make sure that those are getting updated as well.
Totally, right? Yeah, they're like living and breathing as well, right? Which adds a whole other layer of complexity, which I think you guys solve a large majority of that just by being just what you got, the products and service you guys offer. But I'm curious, obviously, like you mentioned open source. I've done some open source projects, and you know, we don't need to talk about that necessarily, but I've had really good experiences with them. But I still find sometimes enterprise or large companies, or even small companies to medium companies, struggle with actually going open source. Why do you think it's so important? It can actually be used in enterprise and actually save businesses, big to small to any size, actually a lot of money.
So let's start from the top.
Okay.
Innovation happens in the bazaar, not at the cathedral. The best ideas are not coming from people who are sitting in buildings next to each other. the best ideas, and the inspiration for innovation comes from anywhere in the world, right? And so that's where I would say it's a small world, right? It's because I think that's the critical, right? Why do you write software? Because you want to innovate, right? And so innovation happens in the bazaar. That's number one. The second thing is it happens transparently with open source.
Sure.
So and given your experience and your listeners, when you write code and you ship software, you are going to have there are going to be some mistakes and bugs. It's just the nature of what you do.
Sure.
The question is, can you make sure you fix them quickly, and a bunch of people are collaborating to fix it rather than the five people that wrote it?
Totally.
And that's what open source does. So open source gives you innovation, but it also gives you a ton of reliability. Right? Because because that piece of code that was written is being used by so many different people in so many different ways that it gets really hardened and making it happen.
Well, and in so many parts of the world, right?
Absolutely. So those two things are very important. So now enterprises have struggled with it because there are a lot of software companies that are not open source. And my take for at least 8 years now has been, if you're going to do something with technology, it better be open source, right? Kubernetes has proved it, right? Cassandra has proved it, and you can just go down the path. Enterprises have struggled to adopt it because software companies were not built on open source projects.
Totally.
But that's changed. Look at companies like DataStax.
Right.
So the second thing that they've struggled with is, should they just be the consumer of it, or should they contribute to the projects? Because that's when you're being a good citizen. You're not just using it, but you're actually giving back as well. And that is what I'm excited about in 2021, Kevin. I can see large companies that we work with, banks, retailers, people that you would normally not think as open source contributors, showing up and saying, we love what you're doing. We love the way you're doing it. Help us get into the communities because we want to contribute. We have use cases we want to bring and have discussions with people so that we can solve them in a creative, collaborative way. And that part is become super exciting.
Totally.
So all of this is around innovation, contribution, reliability. The next thing after that is making it available as a service and making it available with significant cost savings. Right. But I think it starts from innovation and agility and then goes to cost savings. Anybody that just starts with cost savings being the primary reason, I find over a period of time, they'll get disillusioned. You have to start by saying, I'm going to get some really awesome innovation, and I'm going to make sure because of that, I'm going to get a lot of agility.
Interesting. No, I 100% agree with you. And it's cool that you're having those companies in traditional industries that are slower to adopt technology actually wanting to contribute to open source projects, because I think it's very important and it's very useful and everybody benefits from it. But the challenge has to be then, how do you guys manage the DataStax's roadmap? Because you have huge companies using it. You have huge companies contributing to it. They can probably really kind of, sway their weight in where the product potentially goes. So how do you manage, feature requests and features that are coming at you from the community, as well as what you guys are trying to build?
And this is where you have to be the great, very, very insightful question. But this is where you have to be transparent.
Okay.
And be very crisp on the way you execute.
Okay.
The roadmap for the open source project is governed by the people that participate in that open source project. Got you. And everybody gets a vote, but the size of company they work for is not relevant. And which is one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of the Apache way of doing things. Right. And so it is fairly, whether you work for company XYZ or you work for yourself, it doesn't matter. You are one contributor to the one committer to the project. So that's one. Now open source is in our DNA. We will not do something that is not open source, but we don't do all our innovation in open source. We're committed to it. We will do features because the thing about, because of the collaboration of open source, it's not the fastest, more agile way of doing it. So we will always build software that will be outside open source,
right,
with a complete commitment to take it back to open source.
Gotcha.
And go through the process in making it happen. So we get our customers get the best of both worlds. Developers get the best of both worlds. They can go off and use a cloud service,
right,
and we made it really easy to build apps, and we've really made it really easy to manage. And they can use all the cool innovation, knowing very well that whatever we're doing there, they will be able to leverage in the open source communities over time as well. So you have to make sure that you continue to do that cycle, right? In a transparent way with the community, but make sure that you're also serving the enterprise needs.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious then, what advice do you give to companies on actually executing software products? Because, well, as you know, they're complicated. And even just like in the early days, some of the stuff and decisions you make can very much affect you, 6 months, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road sometimes. So what advice do you give people on actually executing their projects and their companies that you've kind of learned over the last number of years?
Design matters.
Okay.
And I'm not saying this because I'm on your podcast.
No, fair.
Right, but design matters because I think, and I mean that across all perspectives, right?
Sure.
I mean, and so that's one. And I'm thinking more big D than small d, but design matters. The second thing is iterate like crazy, right?
Sure.
Because you don't start by saying, I'm going to design something throughout the architecture, the UX, all that stuff, and then I'm going to go off and say, I'm going to implement this over a 6-month period. Like, start with 10% of the functionality and start rolling it out, because you learn a lot, right?
Sure.
We have a saying, having been delivering cloud services for over a decade, is that every service or app has a shakedown period, right? Where you take it, where you actually let people start using it, and you actually shake out all the bugs, and you make it a much better app or a much better service as you go. So the first one would be design. The second one would be iterate like crazy. Those two things. The third thing is be thoughtful on the technologies you pick.
Okay.
Right? Because the thing that you don't want to do is actually change the stack every 6 or 9 months. Because
Sure.
you want that to actually be something, you will have to change it 2, 3, 4 years into it, but you don't, just make sure because you will not get the lift off that you need, because you need to iterate very quickly. And the stability of having a stack makes a massive difference as you go forward. You don't have to be wed to it, but do it like you're committed to it, right? Is the way to look at it. But those would be the 3 things I would say. And the fourth one, by the way, it's obvious, and I cannot say this enough, which is start with an outside-in point of view, right? It is not about you.
Sure.
It is about who you're serving. And so start with how is this person's life going to change because of what they're using? How is it going to help the company that this app is being used by, right? But start with an outside-in point of view, and that should be your North Star as you go forward.
Sure. I'm curious then, do you have any advice for building like a successful startup? I think what you just talked about is actually really valuable to kind of anybody at any company, but do you have any advice? Because obviously you've been from idea to acquisition, You've gotten companies bought by companies that everybody wants basically their startup to be bought by. Is there anything outside of what you just talked about that you learned that you're like, ooh, I wish my startup did this, and then you did it on another startup, or anything that helped you along the way?
That three parts, and there are different parts of a startup, but I think these three, and I'll give you two. I'll answer the question in two different ways.
Perfect.
One is make sure you're really passionate about the problem.
Okay.
That you're solving. So that is really important. Secondly, make sure you're doing it with people you really like.
How do you find those people? Because that can be extremely challenging in my experience.
Yeah, and here's I say this I tell folks who are building companies, take money from somebody who you can have a beer with.
Yeah, it's good advice.
Because you'll be drinking a lot, right? and the point here is that startups, have, in the beginning, right, when things are going, you have many bad days, right? And you want to make sure that, and so the same advice about the VCs applies to co-founders and your team. The beer is just a way of talking about it, right? But I think it's, how do you make sure you do this with people you like? And my take is that trumps skills.
100%.
It's really important for somebody to be very skilled and be super smart, but you don't want to hire assholes either.
Yeah, 100%.
Right? And so number one, be passionate about what you're doing. Secondly, make sure you do it with people you like. And then the third one, which is really important, is have fun.
Yeah.
Because it's going to consume you, right? And if you're not having fun, it's not worth it. Because if you're passionate and you're doing it with good people, create an environment where you're actually having fun. And whatever your version of it might be.
Sure.
Right? It could be video games with somebody, it could be something else with somebody else, could be hiking, whatever. But create an environment in your day-to-day work where you're having fun doing it. So those would be my three things that I would ask them to do. I'll give you a different perspective. I have three words I use on a regular basis to think about how I go into projects or startups or companies, right? And how I assess investments.
Yep.
Do I believe? Do I inspire? And do I execute? In that order. Because it all starts from believing in an idea. It's about inspiring other people to believe in the same idea. And then it's about execution of the idea, making it successful. Right? And so you always have to start, because all good ideas start with one person thinking, wow, or two people thinking it's a great idea. You have to convince other people that they think it's as good. And then the third one is you have to execute on it, because believing and inspiring means nothing without actually the metrics and the results showing up.
No, couldn't agree with you more. So I'm curious, you kind of touched on it. How do you handle like a work-life balance or advice for that? Because I think especially in the early days when you're kind of struggling, maybe you're having bad days, it's easy to put in long hours and kind of forget about your own health and well-being because you're so focused on trying to make it.
Great question. I've always said I've always said this for a long time, which is I want to make sure my kids don't call me uncle, and I hold on to that, right? And so you have to find a way, and there's no silver bullet here, Kevin, where you say, you know what, this is how you do work-life balance. You have to. Anybody that tells me they have work-life balance, my take is either they're not working.
Sure.
Or they're not, or they don't have a personal life, one of the two, because everybody I talk to struggles with it and balances every day. Right?
I'm actually really glad that you said that. Sorry to cut you off. I think that's super important, because why I asked the question is because I figured you were going to give this answer. Is like it's like everybody struggles with it, no matter if it's day one or like you've been at it for decades, right? It's like everybody struggles with it. And like, I think some days you're good at it, some days you're crappy at it. But I really appreciate somebody like yourself actually mentioning that. Keep going. Sorry to cut you off.
No, by the way, it's and my take is, and I think you nailed it, which was what I was going to say, which is there's some days you will be very successful at that balance, and there are others you won't be on both sides.
Sure.
Right. On
Sure.
the personal side as well as your work side. And, the phrase that I've been using recently is loving kindness to
Sure.
yourself, right? To yourself. So don't be too hard on yourself when you over rotate one way or the other, right? As long as you keep thinking about it, you will figure out a way to balance and get through it. But I would just, the other part I was going to say, Kevin, is that, and I think a lot of people don't do this. I've always maintained this. It's been something that's come fairly naturally to me, but I didn't realize how hard it was for folks. I have always maintained that any company I start or I come to work for as a CEO is a company I come to work for. I never use the word my company, because my identity as an individual is separate from that company, and I don't merge them.
Interesting.
And it's really important to me, and I think it's really important to people I work with, that we all realize that we all come to work for DataStax. It is not Chet's company, right? And even if I was a co-founder of the company, I would have said the same thing. This is our company. Yes, I co-founded, but this is our company. I get a paycheck just like you do, right? So let's make sure we make this the best place that we can all excel at.
Interesting. I would think a lot of people don't share that same. I agree with you, and I think that's awesome that you do that. But I think a lot of companies or CEOs or co-founders of a company do not see it like that.
Yeah, and the reason is, it goes back to, because I think, and nothing wrong with a different point of view. I'm giving you
Sure.
mine, but my only take is, the one thing I'm fairly sure about is that, the role you play in your professional life and who you are in your personal life, if you start identifying yourself with the role you play, whether you're a CEO or co-founder, it is not a recipe for a successful path, right? Because there will be many ups and downs,
Sure.
and you need to find a way to separate the two as you go through life.
Yeah, that's actually really good advice. Interesting. So I'm curious, we're kind of coming to the end of the show, but is there any other advice that you want to give people listening, and maybe, or even some stuff that like you wish you knew sooner, or would tell yourself, when you were, doing your first startup or something like that, or anything else you want to kind of close out on? And then I want to talk about your podcast just to kind of close out the show.
Strategy is important, but execution is far more important.
Sure.
I've said this a couple of times, culture or execution eats strategy for lunch, right? Because if you don't have the right environment that people can execute on and actually get the results that you want, you can have beautiful strategies and it doesn't make a difference. So you make sure you have the right strategy, make sure you get the right people, but focus on the results and make sure that whatever you're focused on, you use data to drive those results. Because again, back to what you do in 2021 versus what you did in 2020 or even 2010, right? If you do not have a data-driven approach to be successful, you're doing something wrong.
I 100% agree with you. So you also host a podcast. What's it called? What's it about? And what made you actually decide to start a podcast?
So Inspired Execution is what it's called. And I've had a bunch of people over the last, I would say the last 15 years, tell me that I should write a book. And generally, and generally my response is, it's best to do that later on, because I still want my results to be shown by the companies I help create and lead. But the one thing that occurred to me, and Reid Hoffman, his podcast, Masters of Scale, was awesome. And I was listening to it and I loved it. And so we decided that it's the best way to bring some of my leadership principles, as well as interact with people that I meet on a regular basis. And It started out with just the people I knew. right?
Sure.
And now it's expanded to people I don't know. But it's great to get these folks out who have been very successful, small, large. And we talk about a multitude of things, right? We've talked about diversity. We've talked about culture. We've talked about, during the pandemic, we talked about distributed work. We've talked about how the CEO of a bank in Singapore actually walked around with a nice little card that said, "What would Jeff say?" Right? Basically, Jeff Bezos inspired him. So lots of great small stories from practitioners. Sure. And that was the critical part of what we wanted. We wanted people to not show up and talk about themselves, but actually have nuggets that they could share. And what drives all of it, what I tell everybody I interview is, you're giving advice to a younger version of yourself.
Interesting. Sure.
And by doing that, the bullshit factor goes away, and they focus on real stories that they could have helped, that they could have thought was very useful when they were younger. So we have a blast with it. It's a lot of fun, much like our discussion today. And I think we'll continue doing it. We continue to think about new formats and things like that. We also have a great team that helps. That makes a big difference.
No, that's really great. But sadly, we're out of time. So how about we close with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself, DataStax on the podcast?
Absolutely. So DataStax.com. You can always use Google, but DataStax.com works really well. And Inspired Execution is a podcast available on Google Play as well as on Apple. So you can download it from there and listen to it.
Perfect, Chet. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you. And have a good rest of your day, man.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit our website at buildingthefutureshow.com to join the free community, sign up for our newsletter, or to sponsor the show. The music is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.